U.S. history curriculum. And just to tell you right off the bat, this unit, which covers the time period 1890 to 1945, is a beast. We're going to talk about America's continuing transition from a rural economy to an urban economy, the rise of American imperialism, the Progressive Era, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the rise of popular culture, and technological innovations, just to name a few of the major topics. So baby, get ready, because this is about to get crazy. All right, how about we start with American imperialism? And in case you don't know what imperialism means, it's just a word that indicates the expansion of a nation's empire. And you'll no doubt remember that from the beginning of our fair nation, the ambition to push westward and expand our territory was basically baked into our national identity. We even called it our manifest destiny. And eventually, Americans got what they wanted, a nation that spread from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. But now that we had it, the impulse for expansion didn't just die. After all, you had folks like Frederick Jackson Turner writing The Significance of the Frontier, in which he argued that westward expansion was a crucial part of our national identity.
I mean, if we can't take land from other people, are we even American anymore?
So it's at the end of the 19th century that this American impulse for expansion drove Americans to look beyond our national borders across the world and wonder, who can we take land from then? Now, before this period, Americans dipped their toe into the waters of imperial expansion with the purchase of Alaska in 1867. Now, Russia and Great Britain both laid claim to this territory prior to this, and Russia ended up taking it over, but it became an economic burden to them, especially with the threat of a British retakeover. So it was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, who led the charge for America to buy Alaska, and that's exactly what happened, to the tune of about $7.2 million. But this move was heavily criticized, being variously dubbed Seward's icebox or Seward's folly, because after all, there ain't nothing in Alaska. Well, as it turns out, gold was discovered there in 1898, to which William Seward said,
"Oh, how y'all like me now?"
So all that to say, territorial expansion seemed to pay off, and now there was a growing hunger for more. But as you can imagine, there was a fierce debate about American expansion between the imperialists and the anti-imperialists, and let's look at the arguments on both sides. With Alaska in the bag, imperialists sought further expansion. Why? Well, they wanted more sources for raw materials, and they further wanted more markets to which Americans could sell manufactured and agricultural products. Another part of their argument was the idea of social Darwinism. You see, the imperialists thought that expansion could be the means by which America could flex its national muscles on the international stage, and therefore prove it was among the fittest to survive. I mean, after all, European nations had a long history of building worldwide empires, and hey, if they're doing it, we're doing it.
Oh, so if everybody's jumping off a bridge, you're gonna do it too? Well, do they believe they're racially superior to everybody not jumping off the bridge? Then yes.
Anyway, the social Darwinist thinking was spurred on from a lot of different places, but the racially driven aspects of it were certainly bolstered by writings like Our Country, Its Possible Future and Present Crisis, written by the Reverend Josiah Strong. In that book, he argued that members of the Anglo-Saxon race were the apex of human evolution and were therefore the fittest to survive. Now, Strong was a Christian, so he added that it was the Christian duty of Americans to acquire a worldwide empire so that we could spread Christianity and the glories of Western civilization to the world's dark and backward lands. Also key to the thinking of the imperialists was a book by Alfred Thayer Mahan called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, published in 1890, and in it Mahan argued that any country who wanted to become a world power had to build up and possess a strong navy, which was the only way to secure foreign markets. And so, persuaded by Mahan and others, Congress approved the construction of a new steel fleet of navy ships. Now, what does this have to do with imperial expansion? Well, it's really about what I just said, namely the securing of foreign markets. In order to do that, America would have to possess territory in key locations around the world in order to build coaling and supply stations and patrol our shipping lanes. Okay, those were the main arguments of the imperialists. What were the arguments of the anti-imperialists? Now, I'll talk in more detail about their gripes with the imperialists when we talk about the Spanish-American War, but for now, it's enough to know their main arguments. First, they held to the principle of self-determination for all nations, and if those nations are getting all imperialized, they can't very well self-determine anything. Second, they appealed to America's long history of isolationism in foreign affairs, which was an idea that had its roots all the way back in George Washington's farewell speech. But as it turned out, it was the imperialists who had the heart of the majority of the American people, and that commitment led us right into the Spanish-American War, and how about we talk about that now? So Cuba was a highly desired territory for the imperialists, but it happened to be a Spanish colony, and so in 1895, Cuban nationalists renewed their struggle to overthrow the Spanish, but were crushed back into submission. Back in America, there were a group of journalists known as yellow journalists who published sensational headlines about Spanish atrocities in Cuba, and that had the effect of persuading the American public that American intervention in Cuba was the humanitarian thing to do. But it took an explosion to finally tip the scales of American involvement. One night in 1898, the American battleship Maine exploded as it was docked in Havana Harbor, killing over 200 Americans. A yellow journalist immediately jumped on this and accused Spain of blowing it up, to the great outrage of the American public. Now, later was determined that the explosion was in fact an accident, but the hearts of the American public had already begun to beat fast for war. President McKinley laid out an ultimatum to Spain, demanding a ceasefire from their troops in Cuba, or else war. And Spain was like, okay, done. To which President McKinley responded,
Well, that was altogether unexpected.
yeah, we're still going to war. And so he asked Congress to declare war on Spain, which they did, and after only a few short months, the war was over and America had won. And the outcome of this war had serious effects for America's imperial ambitions, not the least of which was the acquisition of Caribbean and Pacific islands, increased involvement in Asia, and the suppression of a nationalist revolt in the Philippines. Let me explain. Why don't we start with the Philippines? So, as I mentioned before, we had ourselves a fancy new steel navy, and as such, we had to go show it off. And so Teddy Roosevelt, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, sent that new fleet to the Spanish Philippines right before the war and began bombarding the Spanish fleet there. And after that campaign, the U.S. troops staged a land invasion with the help of Filipino nationalists, and they overthrew Spain. And once that war was over, it was agreed that the U.S. would pay Spain $20 million in order to take possession of the Philippines. And ladies and gentlemen, that is how you get an overseas empire started. Now, in case your geography is just a little bit shaky, the Philippines is a long way from the western shores of the United States. And so in that same year, 1898, there was a push to annex Hawaii as well. And the process had already begun in 1893 when American settlers had helped to overthrow the Hawaiian monarch, Queen Liliuokalani. The Spanish-American War and the acquisition of the Philippines just created the pretext to complete the annexation. And not to be forgotten in all this, Puerto Rico became a U.S. territory as well, along with other Pacific and Caribbean islands. Now, it was in acquiring the Philippines that reignited the imperialist, anti-imperialist debates. The anti-imperialists argued that taking possession of a highly populated territory filled with people of a different race and culture was risky business. Additionally, they appealed to American principles principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, wouldn't planting America's imperial flag on another nation prevent them from pursuing these values? Also, establishing rule over the Philippines would for sure get America entangled in Asian conflicts that heretofore had nothing to do with us. But as it turned out, the imperialists won the day, and Congress voted to add the Philippines to the American empire. Now, missing from all this discussion is the Filipino people themselves. Like, when they heard the news of this, they were enraged. They thought the Americans were there to help them throw off imperial control, not reestablish it. And so they rose up to fight against American intrusion. Now, the U.S. was victorious here, but eventually the U.S. granted them independence in 1946. However, not to be rebuffed in Asia, the U.S. moved on to economic tactics to further their expansion, especially in China. And here's where I introduce you to John Hay and the open door policy. Now, Hay was the Secretary of State for McKinley, and he saw America's economic opportunities dwindling in China. Remember that during this period and the previous period, China had been overtaken economically by European powers who had established spheres of influence, which is to say regions in which they enjoyed exclusive trading rights throughout China. So John Hay sent a note to the European powers asking them to observe an open door of trading privileges in China, which would not exclude the United States. And the truth is, none of these powers said no, but they really didn't say yes either, so Hay declared it a victory. Okay, back to America. In 1901, President McKinley was assassinated, and his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, became president, and Roosevelt sought to continue this imperial legacy of his predecessor. And he did so in many ways, but two are especially worth noting. First was TR's big stick diplomacy. Now, when it came to international relations, Roosevelt was fond of saying, speak softly and carry a big stick. It was an aggressive foreign policy that got the U.S. involved in a number of international affairs, most notably the construction of the Panama Canal. Second, we need to talk about the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, remember, back in 1823, James Monroe established his doctrine, which essentially said that the Western Hemisphere is our sphere of influence, and therefore Europeans need to keep to their side of the Atlantic. Now, as it turned out, some Latin American nations were defaulting on their debts to European powers. For example, Venezuela was having trouble paying back its loans to Great Britain, and so in response, Britain sent warships over in 1902 to force payment. Now, of course, that is a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, so Roosevelt declared that, hey, we'll send our own warships to these countries to force repayment because, hey, we're the international police power. And that is the essence of the Roosevelt corollary. Okay, there's so much more to say there, but we've got to move on to the progressive era. So, let's progress, shall we? Nailed it. So Teddy Roosevelt provides the link from all that imperialism stuff we were just talking about into the progressive era. And this era basically runs through Roosevelt's presidency down through Taft, and it's basically over by the time Woodrow Wilson leaves office. And if you want to know the issues the progressives were concerned about, and I know that you do, then here's a list. They were concerned about the rising power of big business, uncertainties in the economy, especially after the Panic of 1893. There was also concern about the increasingly violent conflicts between labor groups and those whom they worked for. They had concerns about the influence of political machines, Jim Crow segregation in the South, although not all the progressives shared this concern, and they had concerns about the rights of women. Now, the progressives themselves were a diverse lot. Among their ranks were Protestant church leaders, feminists, union leaders, black activists, and many others that I don't have time to name. But despite their diversity, one overriding belief really tied them together, and it was this: that American society was in the crapper, and only through vigorous governmental intervention could these societal wrongs be made right. Now, one group that fueled the progressive flame and brought many of these issues to the attention of the American public was a group of investigative journalists who exposed the underbelly of corruption rampant in America. Teddy Roosevelt called these journalists muckrakers because they were in the muck of society and, they were raking it. There were many of these journalists, but I'm only going to introduce you to three. First was Ida Tarbell, whose devastating investigation into the corruption of Standard Oil was published in 1902. Second was Jacob Rees, who was a photojournalist, and his book, How the Other Half Lives, exposed the horrifying and unsanitary conditions of those who lived in urban tenements. Third was Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle to expose unsafe conditions and mistreatment of workers and the unsanitary practices of America's meatpacking industry. Now, as I said, there are many more we can name, but what these journalists all had in common was the impulse to alert the American public to the dangers of societal inequities, corruption in the halls of power, and to help create the occasion for reform. Now, a major reform agenda for the progressives involved voter participation, and they pushed for reforms that would put political decision-making back into the hands of the people and take it away, for example, from political bosses. And there are a few major reforms under that heading that you need to know. First was the secret ballot, which was just a means to vote so that no one could see how you were voting. I mean, prior to this, voting was done in plain sight, and therefore bosses could oversee and apply pressure on voting day. Second was the direct election of senators. Now, recall that the Constitution states that senators will be elected by state legislatures, which was fine in theory, but in reality, the progressives argued, this system had created a Senate beholden to millionaires and big business interests. And through the work of the progressives, the 17th Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1913, which gave citizens the right to vote for senators. Third voting reform was their push to institute the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. Now, the main problem the progressives were trying to solve here was that once politicians were elected, they could choose to follow their own will instead of the will of the people. The initiative was a measure in which voters could force a legislator to consider a bill if they were ignoring it. The referendum was a measure which allowed citizens themselves to bypass the legislature and vote on a bill directly. And recall made it possible to remove a corrupt politician before their term was up. Now, the progressives were also concerned about the efficiency of government. They were largely persuaded on this by the work of Frederick Taylor, and he proposed the idea of scientific management in the context of factory work, which would increase the factory's efficiency. He did this by timing each individual movement with a stopwatch and made proposals for how workers could then save time. And progressives believed that such principles could be applied to government to make it work more efficient as well. And yet another branch of the progressive movement took up the cause of civil rights. Now, since 1896, racial segregation was the law of the land, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the southern states. During this period, thousands of black citizens were brutally lynched, and though this reality hardly made it onto the progressive agenda writ large, black progressives took up the cause for themselves. And it'll be important for you to know that there were basically two approaches to solving this problem. The first was advanced by Booker T. Washington, and he argued that to secure political equality, blacks had to engage themselves in education and economic endeavors. And once they were on equal footing economically, they would have a place on which to stand to demand political rights. The second approach was argued by W.E.B. Du Bois, and he criticized Washington's approach, arguing that for blacks to have any shot at economic equality, they needed to be recognized as politically equal first. Now, despite the fact that there was some disagreement over the method by which blacks ought to gain their rights, several new movements were born that unified the cause. First was the Niagara movement led by Du Bois, and he gathered a group of black intellectuals, and they met and organized for protest and action to secure rights for the black population. Second was the birth of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. This group sought to abolish all forms of segregation and expand educational opportunities for, among others, black children. Now, while much of what I just said about the progressives was going on regionally, progressive presidents took that agenda to a national level. So let's take a real quick look at the progressive presidents and how they sought to work out these principles on the national level. First, as I mentioned before, was Teddy Roosevelt, and TR believed the presidency was about more than just leading the executive branch. Rather, as a representative of the people, it was the president's job to set the legislative agenda for Congress too. So to that end, TR led Congress to pass a series of laws addressing consumer protection. Now, I already mentioned that the public was outraged to read about the rats in their meat after reading The Jungle, and so Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which ensured consumers were eating safe, uncontaminated food, and also they passed the Meat Inspection Act, which set standards of sanitation for meatpacking plants. Additionally, Roosevelt led Congress to pass conservation laws to protect America's disappearing forests and natural resources. In addition to new laws, TR also used existing laws like the Forest Reserve Act of 1891 to preserve 150 million acres of federal land that could not be sold to private individuals or companies. And speaking of using old laws, Roosevelt became known as the Trust Buster because he began vigorously enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act passed in 1890. Under this new enforcement, more than 40 large corporations were dismantled, but it'll also be important for you to know that Roosevelt distinguished between good trusts and bad trusts. The good ones were the ones who, through honest practices, dominated a particular market, and these trusts, Roosevelt argued, needed only to be regulated. The bad trusts, on the other hand, were the ones who needed breaking because they ruined competition by underhanded and deceptive practices. And finally, I should mention Roosevelt's Square Deal. Hopefully you'll recall from the last period that there had been an awful lot of conflict between labor and capital, and that conflict was carried into this period as well. And the difference in this period is that the president got even more involved. So when anthracite coal miners began to strike, TR stepped in to negotiate what he called a square deal for both the workers and the corporation. Okay, so after Roosevelt came William Howard Taft, who broke up twice as many trusts as his predecessor and also continued TR's conservationist policies. And after Taft came Woodrow Wilson in 1912, and he took up the fight against what he called the triple wall of privilege, namely tariffs, banking, and trusts. On his first day in office, Wilson himself addressed Congress on the need to give relief to consumers by lowering tariffs, and as a result, Congress passed the Underwood Tariff, which did exactly that. Second, banks. Wilson argued that the gold standard was inflexible, and banks were beholden to stock speculators on Wall Street rather than serving the interests of the people. And so in 1914, we get the Federal Reserve Act, which established a national banking system overseen by 12 district banks. And all 12 of these district banks were federally regulated. Third, trusts. I'm starting to think you're going to need to remember something about trusts for this period, but, what do I know? Anyway, Wilson continued the tradition handed down by breaking up even more trusts. Most significant here was the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act, which strengthened and clarified the requirements of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Okay, last but certainly not least in the progressive era, we got to talk about the ladies. Women largely took up the cause of temperance, and they saw the abuse of alcohol as one of the main menaces to society. And under the leadership of groups like the Anti-Saloon League, temperance advocates finally got the 18th Amendment passed, which banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol, and if you want a word for it, it was called prohibition. And they assumed that this would right many societal wrongs, but not so much. Also, women's suffrage became another significant fight for the progressives. Some groups petitioned state legislatures for the franchise, and others took to the streets in protests and hunger strikes, and their hard work paid off with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which officially acknowledged a woman's right to vote. Okay, again, so much more to say there, but that's the progressive era. Now let's turn our attention to World War I. Okay, so how did the United States get involved in this war? Well, the answer is not easily. Once the war began in Europe, America did what America do and stayed neutral in the conflict. But several events made that neutrality impossible. First, let me tell you about the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. German submarines were tasked with sinking any ship that came within what they considered the war zone around the British Isles. Now, that made sense if you're talking about battleships, but the Lusitania was a passenger ship, so the ship entered into the war zone and the Germans sunk it, killing most of the passengers on board, including 128 Americans. And after Germany sank a few more ships, the U.S. threatened to break diplomatic relations with them, which is a precursor to war, and so Germany backed off. So that's good news. Thankfully, we don't have to worry about German submarines anymore. Ah, crap, here they come again. About 2 years later, Germany, it seems, couldn't help themselves and resumed their unrestricted submarine warfare and started sinking ships again. But maybe the final straw that broke the camel's back with respect to American neutrality was the Zimmerman telegram. In this little note, Germany solicited Mexico to become an ally, and once the war was over, Germany would help Mexico regain the land that they lost in the Mexican-American War. And thus was American neutrality officially flushed down the toilet. On April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson asked the Congress for a declaration of war because the world needed to be kept safe, in his words, for democracy. Okay, so we're in the war, and I'm not going to mention much about the fighting except this. The American Expeditionary Forces, led by John J. Pershing, were sent to plug up the weaknesses on the French and British lines, and so they saw some limited engagement. However, it wasn't long before hundreds of thousands of American troops showed up and basically took over command of a portion of the Western Front. And while it's true that the American Expeditionary Forces played a relatively limited role in combat compared to the other Allied powers, the American entry into the war had the effect of tipping the outcome decisively in the direction of the Allies. And we'll talk about the peace settlement and the end of the war in a moment, but first we need to see what was going on in the home front while the war was being waged across the sea. So once we were officially in the war, the U.S. mobilized like a boss. Wilson established a buttload of wartime agencies that operated with progressive efficiency, and he centralized control over prices and raw materials, and government agencies encouraged Americans to eat less meat and bread so that the excess could be shipped to the troops. They took control of railroads to coordinate railroad traffic. Additionally, wartime production infused many industries with new life, and that resulted in increased migration of Americans from rural homes to urban centers in search of manufacturing jobs. And a significant portion of this number was a massive group of black Southerners who migrated north seeking jobs in urban centers to the tune of about 1.5 million people. And this movement became known as the Great Migration. And not only did they move to seek new jobs, but an added benefit was an escape from the oppressive nature of Southern segregation. But as it turned out, they faced a healthy amount of discrimination in the North as well. It just wasn't codified into law. Also on the home front, we need to talk about the restriction of civil liberties. Now, in light of public criticism over the government's war efforts from some opposition groups, Congress passed the Espionage Act of 1917. Under this law, anyone who tried to incite rebellion in the armed forces or who did anything to obstruct the draft would be imprisoned. Now, you might think that's unconstitutional, but the Supreme Court of that time would disagree. In a case called Schenck versus the United States, the court considered the following situation. A man had been in prison for distributing literature which argued against registering for the draft, and the Supreme Court handed down a decision which argued that speech indeed can be limited by the government if there is a clear and present danger evident in the speech. Also, with respect to limited civil liberties, we get the Sedition Act of 1918, which prohibited anyone from making derisive or disloyal comments about the government. So it was kind of a hot mess at home home while the war was being waged across the sea. But I said I'd get back to the end of the war, and here we go. World War I ended with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, and President Wilson was deeply involved in the post-war negotiations, and he articulated his agenda in the 14 points. Within these 14 points were provisions for the freedom of the seas and self-determination of nations, and maybe most significant, a League of Nations, which was a collective body where nations could meet and talk about their problems and hug it out instead of shooting at each other. Now, the ironic thing is that the U.S. Senate refused to ratify this treaty in large part because of the League of Nations provision. They feared, among other things, that to be a member of such a body could pull the U.S. into war without approval from Congress. And not to mention, maybe the Republicans were a little salty because Wilson only brought Democrats to the negotiation, but, who knows. So, after the war was over, as you'd expect, there was much rejoicing, but there was also some remaining tensions as well. Anti-German sentiment that was so prevalent during the war shifted to anti-communist sentiment after the war, and these fears gave rise to something called the Red Scare. People feared communist infiltration into America from Russia, and that led to a widespread xenophobia, which, when being defined, is the fear of that which is foreign and strange. Now, this fear led to further immigration restrictions, and the crowning moment of this panic were the Palmer raids. Attorney General Mitchell Palmer tasked an official named J. Edgar Hoover to gather information on suspected radicals and communists, and this led to the mass arrest of socialists and labor agitators. And in the span of a few months, over 6,000 people were arrested or deported. Oh, okay, still with me? Good. Let's talk about the 1920s. How about we start with politics, then go to economics, and then we'll talk about the pretty significant shift in culture happening during this decade. Okay, politics. So at the beginning of the 1920s, it appears that the American people had their fill of progressivism because they went ahead and elected Republican Warren G. Harding, whose campaign promised a return to normalcy. And his presidency was the first in a series of 3 Republican presidents who largely reduced the governmental intervention into society and the economy that was so prized by the progressives. All right, how about economics? Well, the decade began with a slight economic slump, which turned around into fantastic prosperity until the end of the 20s when everything blew up, on which more later. For now, let's stick with the positives. The result of this economic boom was that the standard of living for most Americans increased during this time, one glaring exception being the nation's farmers. Now, business boomed during this period for a couple of reasons. First, increased productivity, and thanks to Taylor's principles of scientific management, factories across the country saved time and increased efficiency. Case in point, Henry Ford's assembly line. Ford took the principles of scientific management and organized his automobile factory so that workers weren't moving around the factory, but instead stayed in one place performing the same task over and over again. And the result was the explosion of automobile manufacturing. Also, there was a shift in energy technology. The increased use of oil and electricity to power factories and provide fuel for the staggering numbers of automobiles further increased productivity. Oh, and don't forget government policy. No small reason that businesses boomed during this period was that the government traded its progressivist obsession with regulation and trust busting for tax cuts and a more laissez-faire approach. Okay, now let's talk about American culture in the 20s. By 1920, more than half of Americans lived in cities, which was a continuation of the urbanizing trend begun in the last period. With respect to women, most of the middle-class ladies were expected to bear children and be homemakers. Urban centers, however, offered opportunities for women entering the workforce, especially in jobs like nursing and teaching. But don't worry, they usually receive lower wages than men for performing the same job. As we're talking about women, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a growing number of women who flouted the inherited cultural norms set for them. They were known as the flappers, and they rejected their stereotypical gender roles by drinking and smoking and getting their hair cut short and dressing in ways that didn't fit the cultural standards for their sex. With respect to immigrants, we had a big spike in immigration after the war, mainly Catholics and Jews from Eastern Europe. And this infusion of immigrants created the occasion for another backlash in nativism, which is basically a policy protecting the interests of native-born folks. Workers feared they'd lose their jobs to immigrants who would work for lower wages. Isolationists feared that these new immigrants would incite revolution. And so put all these in a pot, and baby, you got a stew going. And that stew led to the passage of the immigration quotas in 1921 and 1924. And the effect of these quotas was exactly what you'd expect. They made it increasingly difficult for Eastern European and Asian immigrants to arrive and settle on the American shores. Also, under the heading of culture, we have new forms of art and literature. Popular writers during this time were dubbed the Lost Generation by Gertrude Stein, and she called them this because they were largely disillusioned by the immense sacrifices of wartime and religious hypocrisy. Some of the significant members of the Lost Generation included F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and Ezra Pound. Northern blacks had themselves a particularly significant literary movement during this time, and it was known as the Harlem Renaissance. And as a result of the Great Migration, a huge population of black folks resettled in the Harlem section of New York City. And there, musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and writers like Langston Hughes and Claude McKay and Zora Neale Hurston developed a distinct art that grew out of the black experience. Also in this decade, we saw new forms of mass programming which had the effect of promoting a kind of mass culture. First in line was the growing popularity of the radio. Now, by 1930, America boasted more than 800 radio stations, and programming from these stations streamed into about a third of all American households. Also, motion pictures or movies became another form of mass entertainment and a distribution channel for mass culture. Additionally, and probably most dramatic, was the crisis in American values during this period, and nowhere was this more evident than the growing division among Protestant Christians who lived in rural areas versus those who lived in urban areas. Within the larger category of Protestants, there were two ideological groups battling for dominance. There were the modernists who embraced the changing culture with respect to gender roles and scientific discoveries like Darwin's evolutionary theory of origins. They believed their Christianity was wide enough to embrace such things. On the other side were the fundamentalists, and they were mostly the rural bunch and largely condemned this changing of morals. They argued that every word of the Bible must be taken literally, not least the Genesis account of six-day creation. Now, this conflict was put on display for the nation in a sensational trial known as the Scopes Monkey Trial in 1925. So in Tennessee, it was illegal to teach Darwinian evolution to public school children, but a teacher by the name of John Scopes decided he was going to go ahead and give it a try. So he was arrested. It was Clarence Darrow who defended Scopes, while the prosecutor representing fundamentalist values was three-time populist presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan. In the end, Scopes was convicted, but the conviction was thrown out on a technicality. But that's not what's important. What's important about this case is that since this whole trial played itself out right in the plain view of the public, fundamentalism was discredited in their sight because it was unable to adequately defend against the modernist onslaught of Darrow and his incisive pummeling. All right, moving on. You ready to get depressed? All right, let's talk about the Great Depression. So, as I said, despite all the shifting morals in the 20s, it was in fact a decade of fantastic prosperity for many Americans. But all of that came to a crashing halt when the stock market collapsed on October 29th, 1929, also known as Black Tuesday. So, what happened? Well, as I already mentioned, the 20s weren't a great decade for farmers. They had overproduced and were under crushing loads of debt, so they're already suffering economic hardship. And then on Black Tuesday, the rest of the nation joined them. Now, there are a lot of reasons this occurred, but I'll just mention the most immediate cause. Throughout the 20s, the practice of buying stocks on margin grew rampant. And this just means that people borrowed money to invest in the stock market with the assurance that as the stocks grew in value, the debt that they incurred to buy the stock would be repaid, and that was a good assumption for most of the decade. But on October 24th, a huge volume of stocks were sold, and therefore prices were quickly depressed. On October 29th, in response to these depressed prices, panicky investors ordered their brokers to sell sell even more, but there were no buyers available. And the point is, everyone lost their money, and this event ushers us into the Great Depression. Over the next few years, poverty and homelessness abounded as foreclosures on mortgages increased. People took to living in shantytowns called Hoovervilles, and this name was meant to mock President Herbert Hoover, whose Republican laissez-faire ideals kept him from intervening in the crisis before it was too late. And so, fed up with this hands-off approach to governing, the American people elected a Democrat in 1932, namely Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt believed in active government, and he did more to expand the size and scope of the federal government than any president before him. His legislative agenda to help Americans weather the storm of the Great Depression was called the New Deal, and in this he promised to address what he called the 3 R's: relief for the unemployed, recovery for businesses, and reform of economic institutions. So let's consider each of these briefly. First, the New Deal worked for relief for the unemployed. To this end, many programs were created, but I'm only going to mention 2. First, the Public Works Administration, or the PWA, employed people for infrastructure work like building roads and dams and bridges. The Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, hired people to run electric power plants and control erosion and flooding. And there's plenty more of these alphabet soup programs, but you get the idea. Second, the New Deal worked for recovery for businesses and for reform of economic institutions. Key here is the Glass-Steagall Act, which increased regulation in banks and limited the ways that banks could invest people's money. Also, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was created, or the FDIC. The FDIC insured people's bank deposits with federal money so that they could feel safe putting deposits in banks again. And a further reform was the passage of the Social Security Act of 1935, which collected a portion of workers' wages to be set aside and then paid monthly to those who were retired. Now, I've only scratched the surface of the scope of the New Deal, but the effect of it all was that it transformed the United States into a limited welfare state and completely redefined the goals of modern American liberalism. Now, it shouldn't surprise you that although the New Deal did much good for a lot of Americans, there was certainly some opposition to its implementation. Those who were more liberal than Roosevelt criticized it for doing too much for businesses and not enough for the unemployed and the poor. Conservatives criticized it because it seemed to them extreme governmental overreach. That's probably too tame a way to say it. Conservatives thought the New Deal to be outright socialism, if not a slippery slope into communism. And so conservatives took their battle to the Supreme Court, which actually agreed with them, handing down a decision that limited the scope of the New Deal. And FDR, wily fellow that he is, sought to mitigate this defeat by proposing a judicial reorganization bill which would allow the president to appoint new justices for every justice over the age of 70 and a half. And if it had passed, this would have allowed Roosevelt to appoint 6 new justices to the court, all liberal of course, and that's why it was popularly known as the court packing bill. Interestingly, both parties of Congress strongly opposed this scheme because they saw it as a tampering of constitutional checks and balances, and they saw it as a dangerous desire from Roosevelt to assume dictatorial powers. And so the plan was struck down. Now, regardless of any success or failure it had, the New Deal left a legacy of reforms and regulatory agencies in its wake. It also fostered a long-term political realignment of blacks and working class folks and ethnic minorities into the Democratic Party, whom they believed tried to help them in the midst of their suffering during the Great Depression. Okay, now we'll never know if the New Deal would have actually dug America out of the Great Depression because in 1939 a new world war came along that effectively did it for us. So let's talk about World War II. After World War I was over, American foreign policy slid back into isolationism, which meant the U.S. wasn't interested in any further entanglements in the wider world. We just needed to work on us for a little bit. And this was Herbert Hoover's bent, but not so with Roosevelt. But I get ahead of myself. How did this war begin? Well, we can locate the beginning of the Second World War in the rise of fascist and authoritarian governments in Italy and Germany and Japan. And the aggressive action began with Japan's invasion of China, more to the point Manchuria, in 1937. And then in 1939, Adolf Hitler invaded Poland on behalf of Germany. And upon doing so, France and Great Britain then declared war on Germany, and baby, World War II has begun in earnest. Now, most Americans were concerned about the rise of fascism and totalitarian governments in Europe, but they still clung to their isolationist tendencies. Even so, once the war began, it was pretty clear where American loyalties lay, namely with the Allies. Roosevelt began gradually giving aid to the Allied cause, most notably Great Britain. It began with the cash and carry policy, in which Roosevelt persuaded Congress to pass a looser neutrality act that allowed any belligerent in the war to purchase arms from the U.S. as long as they paid cash and used their own ships to transport them. And on the surface, that sounds like a pretty neutral thing. Hey, we'll sell guns and ships to anyone who could make it over here. But since Britain effectively controlled the seas, it was really only they who could benefit from this program. Now, as the war escalated, cash and carry gave way to the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed Britain to obtain the arms they needed from the U.S. on credit. And so in all of this, the United States could still technically claim neutrality, but all of that changed on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese launched a surprise attack on an American naval base in Pearl Harbor. And, maybe it wasn't a complete surprise because after all, we had cut off Japan from crucial oil and gas supplies early in the summer, but Anyway, that event led Americans to shed any notion of isolationism, and that is how we got into the war. So now mobilization began, and as a result, federal spending increased by something like 1,000% in order to produce what the nation needed to go to war. And it was that kind of spending and production that effectively pulled us out of the Great Depression. In fact, the U.S. gross domestic product increased by 15% during this time, to which I say, dang. Private factories were commandeered for wartime production, and instead of producing cars, factories produced planes and tanks. And it was America's strong industrial base that proved pivotal to the success of the American war effort. African Americans joined the American military to the tune of about 1 million soldiers, and despite fighting for the American cause, they continued to face discrimination in the ranks. Mexican Americans too served in the war to the tune of about 300,000. And as such, many farms were left without laborers, and therefore in 1942, Mexican farm workers were given a special provision to enter the U.S. and help with harvest season without having to go through the normal immigration procedures. We should also talk about Japanese Americans. Despite being American citizens, they were associated with the hated Japanese enemy across the sea. Therefore, as a group, they were under suspicion to be spies for the Japanese government, and as these paranoias combined with racist beliefs, the U.S. government sent over 100,000 Japanese American citizens into internment camps. Now, this move, of course, was a gross violation of the rights of citizens, and it was challenged in the Supreme Court in a case called Korematsu versus the United States. But the court actually handed down a decision that upheld the internment camps as a wartime necessity. Okay, now let's talk briefly about the fighting of the war. As in World War I, the tide of the war shifted with the American entry, and once Americans were committed, they saw this war as a fight for the survival of democracy and freedom against the growing threat of fascist totalitarianism. And later in the war, the sentiment was only strengthened as news of German atrocities came to light, most notably the Holocaust. As U.S. troops advanced through Germany Germany, they found Nazi concentration camps that had been responsible for the slaughter of over 6 million Jews as part of Hitler's final solution to rid Germany of the Jewish race. Now, the crucial turning point in the European theater was the D-Day invasion on the Normandy beaches of northern France, and it was the largest amphibious invasion in history, and it was successful, but at an awful cost of life. But once the beach was taken, Allied forces pushed the Germans back until France was liberated and then made the final push into Berlin. Germany surrendered on May 7th, 1945. But the fighting did continue in the Pacific theater, and after a decisive victory at Midway Island, U.S. forces engaged in an island-hopping campaign, and the strategy here was to bypass the heavily fortified islands in favor of smaller, less strategic islands, effectively cutting off the Japanese supply line, and it worked. But ultimately, it was the deployment of a devastating new weapon, which is to say the atomic bomb, that ended the war with Japan. Americans dropped 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima and the second on Nagasaki, and these bombs had a destructive power the likes of which no one had ever seen, and at that, Japan surrendered. Now, because the war was largely fought in Asia and Europe and not in the U.S., those places were devastated in a way that America was not, and that provided the occasion for the U.S. to assume a dominant role in the post-war peace settlements. Now, in the next unit, we're going to deal with some of those settlements and how they played out, but for now, it's enough to know that as a result of all this, the United States emerged as the most powerful nation on Earth. And that's where we're going to leave Unit 7. I'll see you in Unit 8.